All right.
Okay, so we have 1 minute before we're supposed to start, so if you'd find a seat, please.
My clock says that it's time.
It is now time. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Just want to start off by thanking Suzanne for she agreed to take the minutes. Thank you. So this is the DIEM BOF. If that's not your destination, please find another room. This, like all other IETF sessions, is under the note well. Please make sure you understand your responsibilities and your rights and your privileges according to this before you contribute. Meeting tips is basically, if you're remote, please make sure your audio and video are off unless you are participating. And if you're in the room, make sure you use the data tracker to sign in. And we will be managing the mic queue using that. In addition, I want to make sure you treat each other well. So remember, we're here as professionals and treat each other accordingly. This is the agenda we posted a couple weeks ago. Is there any agenda bashes to this agenda? Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Martin to do the summary of what happened at the last BOF and what we hope to get done today.
All right. So this is the second BOF on this topic. We met at the last IETF meeting and we talked about use cases. And so we heard from a number of people who have different use cases in this general area. We heard from the ICRC, we heard from people who have other humanitarian interests. We heard from folks who are looking to provide information in war zones. We heard from folks who are looking to do customs and other physical emblems on shipping materials. And we also heard from folks who are interested in providing emblems for use in protecting movement of the press and their equipment, I believe. And so I think at this point we have a relatively good understanding of the breadth of potential use cases that exist in this area. That's not the purpose of this meeting. If you've not gotten accustomed to the range of possible things that are that might be included in the scope of the working group, I suggest that you very quickly go off and do some reading on those things. We're not going to be covering use cases during this discussion. What we're looking to do during this discussion is to help refine down the scope of the work that we're potentially going to embark on in the IETF. And so we want to know whether there's one single unified use case. We want to know whether that really can be broken down into multiple things. We want to understand the terminology that we use to describe the one or many things that we're likely to put in scope. And we're looking to understand where, if there are what appear to be disparate use cases, whether there are unifying things that underpin those that will allow us to attack them as a single problem. And so what we've got on the agenda today is specifically designed to drive toward understanding what the scope of a working group will be. And to do that, we realized that there is very important questions around the words that we use to describe the work. I think there's been a long chain of discussion on the mailing list about what it is that a digital emblem truly means to different people. And part of that discussion that we're having today, led by Brian, will be to sort of clarify those terms and help understand where the differences of opinion are and perhaps where the similarities exist. So if there are any questions on that or any disagreement with that sort of thing, I think we'll probably hand off to Brian, and he can help sort of walk through the challenges that we've uncovered in our discussion on the mailing list and hopefully help us drive towards some sort of resolution on those. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. So like Martin said, I mean, what I'm really trying to do here is make sure we all kind of have a shared perspective of the areas that we're trying to work in, and kind of flesh out a little bit of those definitions that I think are going to be very important for what we might do in this effort going forward. So next slide, please. Like Martin said, we don't need to talk about all these cases. I think there's been a lot of discussion around those use cases, and it's really more of a question of how do we scope it down to a set that makes makes sense for the kind of work that we do here in the IETF. The big question is making sure that have we identified the use cases well enough that people can make decisions as to whether or not it should be in scope or out of scope. So that's part of that discussion we have to have today. The other part of this is, and from my perspective, and I know from talking to a few other people, they've been really surprised at how many different stakeholders have shown up to at least represent their particular use cases and how it might be addressed in the IETF, and making sure that we understand how to interact with them in order to get the right information in order for us to do productive work. Some of the things that I've noticed in conversations with people is, there are a lot of use cases, but there are some common requirements that seem to come out for the most part. I think the important question is have we identified all the key requirements that we need in order to make decisions on what we might do here? And so part of that discussion is figuring out, are we missing something? The other part of it is a little bit on the flip side. Do we actually see unique requirements per use case that would actually preclude some level of common solution? And when I use common solution here, I'm not necessarily saying one big monolithic solution. Are there key components that can be used in different use cases, even if there might be different mechanisms wrapped around it, whether it's discovery or binding or what have you? And then, is that just a profile of that standard, or does it actually have to be something completely unique? So these are the kinds of things we need to worry about. Next, please. One thing that a lot of us, try and avoid here is coming up with standards for each distinct use case. So can we actually come up with a set of use cases that can be that have a shared solution? It may not be one big solution that satisfies all the use cases, but are they the ones that we're most interested in? Some of the discussions on the mailing list really kind of get to the distinction between different types of use cases. So, protecting a physical asset seems to be distinctly different from protecting digital ones, mainly because of how do you actually do the discovery? How are the emblem and the asset binded together? Those are things that we need to figure out. Where are we going to scope all this? But the important thing is going back to my previous slide, are these distinct enough that we actually need separate solutions, or can it be, say, a data representation that then has some separate functions or different functions that get wrapped around it? I know a lot of people have talked about, we already have a lot of things going on in the IETF. I'm not going to run through the list of working groups that got mentioned last time. They're up there. You guys can read them. I'm sure I probably forgot about half a dozen as well. But those working groups are not chartered to actually work in this space. And so do we actually need a working group that's going to coordinate how those other protocols get used if we want to try and move something forward in the digital emblem space? The other thing that has come out in some conversations, and this gets very dicey from that information perspective, is when you start talking about having to associate an identity or an identifier with some of these protected assets, does that raise other risks that we have to worry about? Does that bring in other requirements that we haven't considered yet? So the important thing here is understanding the potential for additional capabilities not being considered yet because we haven't thought about the implications in that identity space. Please. So when we came out of the last BOF, we had a lot of people using a lot of words. What are we talking about here? I think that in order for us to actually have a productive engagement in a working group, we have to have a shared terminology so that everybody is actually working towards the common problem. For the most part, I think there's some terms that have been thrown around that we, for the most part, agree on. And these terms shouldn't be a surprise. These are things that we see in other protocols and other use cases. There may be a little bit of nuance here from a digital emblem perspective, but I think we have a good idea of what they actually mean for the use case we're talking about. The one that really we have to come to a decision on is what do we actually mean by digital emblem. And from my perspective, if we can do that, or if we can't do that, we may end up with somewhere between 0 and working groups. So I think the important part is how do we define it? And are there other critical terms that we need to define as well? I'm going to focus on the digital emblem because that's the one that I think is most important for the discussion. But if other terms come up, we need to make sure that we have that shared understanding. So with that, next, please. So these are, for the most part, the 4 primary definitions that have been popped up on the mailing list. This is not a proposal for what the terms should be. These are the things that people have said. And I think this is where we need to spend a little bit of time trying to figure out, do we have a common definition of what we're talking about when we say we're going to build a digital emblem? There are some commonalities in these definitions, but I think there are some distinctions that are very important here. And so when we think about what this definition looks like, this is probably the first thing we need to worry about. Because if we can't decide on what we're talking about, I don't think we're going to be very successful in actually defining a standard that actually represents it. So with that, you want me to ask questions?
Sure. So now the mic lines are open. If you have a preference for a particular definition here, or you think that there's something that's missing in Brian's list of possible options, I'm sure that there are many that are missing. What we'd like to do is sort of drive down to the details here and understand which one of these definitions, or which definition in particular, and not restricted to these, is what we collectively understand is what is a digital emblem.
And I think the first thing I'm going to say is thank you, Suzanne, because this may be a fun part of the conversation.
All right. Mike, I think, is on the queue first. Oh, Bill, did you want to get yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, Mike Burrock here. No, thanks for this. I think there's really clearly defined real-world use cases for this, so it's an interesting topic. The terminology side is a little bit concerning, maybe interesting to me, in the sense that it's very similar to things we see well-defined elsewhere and being referenced all over the place. And I wonder how much of this is already covered by other groups at IETF, especially SPICE, because like in our case, like when I went ahead and started conversations around SPICE in the first place, it was for US CBP and other border agencies, and cross-border transit, identification of product, linkage of physical materials, et cetera. So a lot of very similar things, right? How do we have these digital secure representations with a 3-party model, which is kind of what we're describing here.
Right.
Do I think that means that there shouldn't be a working group here? Not necessarily. It's just that we may want to make sure that we're using the building blocks that exist elsewhere, right? Be it Jose or COSE, or things that are then, profiling those things and building out off of them, like SPICE, linking back to SCID when you need audit trails and stuff like that. So, right. Curious on your take on that.
So
take my answer later.
So my personal take is these were definitions that were talked about on the DIEM mailing list. I actually had a conversation with a couple of folks and said, now, where do we have common definitions in other places that we need to worry about? So Mike, I think your point is very valid. We need to make sure, especially if you think about all those working groups I listed on the last slide, do we actually have a common definition that works across the scope of the IETF? Ted.
Ted Hardy, a fan of working backwards from the answer. I think in your previous slide, you said that what you had was a cluster of 3 things, and that cluster of 3 things ended with somebody validating the attestation. So if I look at this and I say, working backwards, what we have here is an attestation about attributes which may be validated. And I would say that the emblem is the attestation of the attributes which may be validated, because that's the only thing at the end of the day that the person who's validating is going to check. Is this attested by somebody that should attest to this? The person who's issuing the attestation is the one who does the attributes. So from my perspective, if we're going to define emblem, we define it in terms of the attestation, because that's what's going to be validated at the end of the day.
Okay,
Thanks.
thanks.
Juan Carlos?
Juan Carlos Zúñiga. Thanks a lot, Brian, for this
Sure, Juan Carlos.
very interesting. I have a,
Talk to the mic.
sorry. Yeah. I was just reading your text, and I think it's very good. I'm just a little hesitant about when we talk about law and legal information. Is there a jurisdiction that we are constrained to, or we want to make it generic enough so that it can be applicable to even other frameworks like cultural or something like that, that is not necessarily.
So some of the specific use cases that have been discussed have an anchor in law.
I agree.
And I think so some of those conversations, some of the proposed definitions assume that as one of those attributes, as Ted was pointing out. From my perspective, don't think that we have to say that it has to be a law-based anchor, but that also comes into play when we say what is the actual scope and which are the use cases that we're going to focus on. But in general, I don't see it as being specific to law.
Or jurisdiction.
Right. And
Right?
I mean, the original, the first definition, the one that Russ threw out there as a, as a starting point, it doesn't say anything. Right. So that's what we have to figure out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So just briefly, this is one of the questions that we want to clarify here, which is, does a digital emblem necessarily include protection in law or not? And we've heard a number of different opinions on this one.
Bill Woodcock, to address that first, I would say I don't think there's any reason to do that, just as there's no reason to say HTTP is for websites about cats, particularly, right?
Right.
So that's just a use case. So I think first and foremost, this is a communications protocol between issuers and validators, right? So it is a way of communicating information from an issuer to a validator, specifically from an issuer to a validator about an asset. And so then the question is, what information needs to be communicated? I think we're overly prescriptive if we say specifically what information arbitrary issuers can say to arbitrary validators. We don't need to do that, just as we don't need to say that it needs to be about cats. So we have essentially 2 kinds of things. The primary thing that we're communicating is bindings, right? Things that allow the validator to understand that the thing they're looking at is the thing that the issuer is talking about. So bindings, what is the quantity? What is the location, right? Does it have any visual characteristics that are unique, right? Things like that, or a big set. And then there's the sort of handling and what to do about it, right? If it arrives dead, are you supposed to contact the issuer, right? Things like that are not characteristics that allow you to bind it. They're instructions or additional information or whatever. So I think really what we've got is a bundle of records that are being communicated from issuer to validator about an asset. And the bundle includes bindings and other information. And I don't think we really want to be more prescriptive. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, some of these things are getting quite abstract and speaking to a very broad set of use cases that I have trouble distinguishing from digital credentials or the SPICE work. In terms of the terminology, I think it would be useful to describe protective digital emblems and describe, like, sometimes we're talking about digital assets versus physical assets. I think it's more useful to describe how the protection is applied or how it's being interacted with. Like it is true that we could set a scope of work about how to bind physical and digital representations of something. That would be that would be an interesting broad set of work. I think it would be more useful to describe assets that are being interacted by the verifier digitally. So rather than like talking about like how can we send arbitrary data of all kinds, I think we should talk about protections from digital interaction.
Rohan?
Hi, Rowan May. So I'm going to try to answer your questions, Brian. So with regards to the definition of an asset, I think that while I agree conceptually with Bill about we can make the technology that works in all these use cases, I think for the sake of the scope of this working group, I think that initially saying that we're doing something that has special treatment in law is a good place for us to define the scope. I would avoid using the word protection, but treatment certainly includes protection. I would also say maybe we would consider as a group for physical assets coming up with a limited set of ways in which we want to do a binding. So for example, like a printed URL, a URI or a QR code, a Bluetooth beacon, or Bluetooth of connection of some kind, and NFC. And I think if we do those things, I think we have a reasonably small scope. And I do support this work with a scope like that. I think we want to be able to have multiple use cases and be able to configure them so that different communities can use them with different authorities, for example. But we also want a scope which is small enough that we can have reasonable discussions about it. And then I think we can put words in the charter that say, to the extent that this technology is usable by for other use cases which do not involve special legal treatment or whatever, they're free to do that. But we're not going to do any special work in the initial working group to go and do that. And I think that allows us to maybe do some work in a single working group, I hope.
So stay there for a second, because a clarifying question. So is it the case that you think that there's something special that we have to do because there's legal protections or
legal treatment?
Legal treatments?
I mean, I think the one piece of information that we want to include is the specific, what is the specific law or the specific treatment that is being that's being signaled. But I don't think that there's any other special technical requirement per se.
So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is that just an attribute then that becomes a part of whatever data bundle that we build here?
I believe so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Andrew?
Hi, Andrew Campling. I think I broadly agree with what was just said. And if I was looking, I know we should probably wordsmith things, but the fourth of your sub-bullets, I would maybe just add something like a set of verifiable attributes with an asset that conveys protection of the asset under international humanitarian law and focus on that one use case. Otherwise, it's too difficult. And then leave it open to others to see if they can adapt it elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Tommy Jensen, Microsoft. I'm in favor of the second definition because I think digital emblem as a proper noun should be generic to the things that we are discussing. However, I do think that it's important to scope to recognize by law, not so much because it introduces new requirements, but forbids some requirements. And as an example, in the protective cases we're talking about, we do not want any solution we develop here to inform later behavior of a network peer, which sometimes we do in other protocols where if this peer presents certain information, then we must terminate the connection or send additional data. And because these are encodified in law, we do not want our solutions to enforce the behavior. If the attacker of a Red Cross bearing asset wants to attack it, that is so not our business. Just the signaling of the protection, right? I think that it would behoove us to define sub-terms that will allow us to scope what we need to work on that are strict subsets of digital emblem. But I think this is a useful definition to start with.
Okay.
Warren Kumari, Google. So I think the first terminology thing works fine. I think the second one's okay, but only if we were to change it to the meaning of these attributes informs the recipient how they should treat the asset. Whether or not it has to do with law, I think is fine, and I think that could be chartered, sort of discussed in the charter. But I don't think that if you were to change it and remove sort of legal information in the digital asset, that stops it being a digital asset. So, I think we could say, we will only talk about digital assets that are scoped in law. But if they didn't have that, if it wasn't scoped in law, I don't think it stops it being a digital asset.
I will talk with you later.
Hi, Michaela, Article 19. I'm just a bit concerned about the scope here, and maybe it's perhaps it's evolved since I originally looked at this work. But if I understood correctly, it's quite hard to disentangle the legal and kind of normative frameworks from here, because if I understood this, the idea is this for it to be something like a red cross or a white flag, something that's understood universally to know that this is a protected asset. So it's not, for example, as someone else mentioned, a parallel to HTTPS. By using HTTPS, you're not necessarily inviting protection. You're not necessarily, you are getting a security element there. And forgive me, I'm not technical, but the idea here is that you have to consider the groups that you're trying to protect here. It's important to consider the potential vulnerabilities that would come with this. It's important to consider the effect that this would have on the end users who would be using this. So I would just encourage us to be potentially a bit more nuanced in how we consider the scope here. And if the aim, it's not just a verification or authenticity mechanism. It sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, that it's aimed to protect a very particular type of asset.
So I think this kind of gets back to those conversations about which use cases we're talking about. And so it does run the gamut. And part of the reason why I started this whole conversation with, here's the scope. Where are we trying to bring this down to where we can come up with a concrete, agreeable, consensus-based definition of the use cases? And then that leads to what is the definition of the digital emblem, which gets to your point about certain attributes may have sense in some other and don't make sense for others.
Sure. Well, if we are grounding international humanitarian law, for example, that already has a quite more limited scope, right? It's not, if I understood correct, I also don't follow SPICE as closely as maybe I should after this discussion, but SPICE, if I understood, has a bit more of a broader context in which it could be applied. So here you're trying to figure out what's the special sauce that you're bringing here.
Right.
So that could provide one way to look at it. And if you also define what are the normative frameworks, then I'm happy to work with you on that, on what normative frameworks you should be considering there. Those already provide some scope there.
Okay, thanks.
Mike Christie, speaking as a kind of member of the international press. To me, it seems like the information that you bind to an emblem is kind of agnostic in a way, whether it's an international humanitarian law or a convention that's supposed to protect the bearer of an emblem, or it's a website that you can go to identify who the bearer of this emblem is. So I'm not technical either. And so I'm just speaking from a layman's perspective here as a potential user or stakeholder, as a member of the media. If I choose to say I'm protected by X, or I choose to say my name is Y, seems non-technical. That's just a data point you attach to an emblem. So my inclination as an international media would be to say, yes, by all means, find a use case that you can use to guide the creation of the emblem, but leave the actual data that you end up attaching to it open to a decision by the end user.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Okay, the queue is empty. Give a moment to see if anyone else wants to join.
Do you want to summarize what you think? What do you want us to do? So yeah, this is the hard question. Is summarizing what so I didn't hear anyone come up and say that digital versus physical was a distinction that they thought was particularly relevant in this context. If anyone disagrees, let me know. I think there's something of an open question about the extent to which we lean on the question of legal protections or the implication thereof. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be something that we can maybe finagle in the way that Warren suggested, which is that perhaps it might be that the issuer is making claims about how they think the asset should be treated by a verifier, but not implying anything about what legal protections might be conferred. Stephen, you're interrupted.
Just generally, I think one working group should be formed here. It's not the same as all other working groups, so we should go ahead and do it. But specifically, why I came to Mike was, it seems to me that the digital asset in that phrase, the digital word there is irrelevant.
Yes.
That was the first point that I made. That's the first point that I made.
I was just wanted to clarify that was what you meant.
Yeah.
You didn't mean that we were forbidden for talking about things that maybe have a physical representation as well as a digital one.
Right. And so I think what I heard uniformly through all of this was that everyone was happy, or even implicitly so, that the digital word in that first definition doesn't belong, and it may be digital and it may be otherwise. Now, if that's something that people disagree with, there's a mic line, and I see there's a queue forming. So let's try to drain that queue and see if we can get to the bottom of this one. Nick.
Yeah, I just got back onto the queue to remind Martin that I tried to make the exact opposite point, which is that it's dramatically different work and needs different definition for the physical versus digital case. My suggestion was that rather than trying to define the asset, we define how the verifier is interacting with it to make it even narrower. That you are interacting with a digital. That is how we need to communicate a protective emblem. We don't need to speak to the very complex set of work about how you bind physical and digital communication.
Okay.
So what I think I heard Nick said, and maybe he'll correct me, but this kind of goes back to the way I started. One of my discussions was there are different attributes here. The attributes are going to be specific to use cases, so we need to be flexible in the attributes that we can put into the digital emblem. But then there are also functions that are wrapped around the digital emblem that are going to be use case specific, like discovery and binding. And my question for Nick is are there specific attributes that you would deal with in the digital emblem that really are physical versus digital? Or is that just a description of the asset itself that's in the digital emblem?
Or no?
Oh, well, Brian asked Nick a question. I think if Nick wants to respond, then
You can get back in the
Okay,
queue.
he's coming back. I didn't see him.
yeah. If he popped in.
I'll try without video. I think what makes it an emblem is that it's not just arbitrary metadata. If the intention is that this should be a new working group to describe metadata, that seems like too large a project.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Arnaud?
Yes, Arnaud Tadei. I'm going to ask a very naive questions because I must say I'm quite uneducated on the whole problem, but here is my naive problem. In the physical world, I'm a bad guy. I see something physically that says, whoa, that's an ambulance, that's a medic. I recognize there is a limit that if I cross it, then if I'm caught, then I'm going to have a certain number of issues. But when I am a cyber criminal and I do an attack, when is it that I bump into a digital emblem? I would like somebody to explain me this because it may have consequences of what we are doing here. So again, I may be completely naive, but I can see many ways that an attacker would come on something and has no chance to realize, oh, I'm crossing a red line. So if somebody can explain me this, I would be very happy.
Maybe my comment will help a little. Since you busted the cap on digital versus physical, I was going to save this for the charter discussion. But in the charter that we've been iterating on the list, we broke down the work areas without trying to determine which set of use cases we'd work on into 3 areas. I do not think that it is necessary to distinguish the types of digital emblems for the format because we're likely going to reuse something already defined. It's a well-explored problem. And the same may or may not be true with determining source of authority. But the third bullet in terms of conveyance, discovery, the protocol that actually communicates it, the types of emblems introduce pretty significant differences in requirements that warrant drawing lines around. These will probably need different solutions. And this is actually the perfect example is when I discover something physical, when my pre-existing relationship with an asset is physical, proximal, visual, the protocol I'm going to use to end up discovering it, like I need to find a way to contact it digitally or it needs to beacon or something. If my relationship with the asset only exists digitally, that I contacted it over a network, the protocols are very different. Even if they convey the same types of information that I do not think makes sense to put into a single solution and probably not even into a single working group. And it's because of that aspect. None of that is to say that the emblem format needs to be special based on whether it's legal or not. But things like not revealing the validator to the asset is pretty unique to protective legal emblems. Emblems that convey things like verifiable location or content of containers that are also in the use cases list don't have that requirement, but may have other new ones about the history of the emblem's contents.
Dennis
Jackson. So I think, this got posed as quite an abstract question about terminology. And I don't know, I don't like to argue about terminology. As long as someone's willing to say, this is what I think it means, I'm happy to use somebody else's terms. But the slightly different question about what is the thing that we should do within the scope of this working group, I think that's kind of what this conversation has drifted onto from the very abstract, what is this definition? And I think that's a slightly different and much more difficult question. So I'm happy for digital emblem to be any of those things, but I have a much stronger opinion about, in the context of this, a proposed working group, what that means. And I think, there is a very, distinct set of requirements for things that exist in that international humanitarian law space that require, very specific understandings. Like it's not necessarily about authorization or attestation. It's potentially about a claim rather than, who is authorized to make that claim. It's about a claim that is being made that somebody then judges. And I think that, if we're going to I would not weight too heavily any particular decision on what digital emblem means, as opposed to what are the kinds of digital emblem, what are the kinds of thing that we want to talk about in the context of this work, which I proposed working group.
Thank you. Rahel?
Hi, Rahel Feinstein, JHU. So I think that the discussion about whether or not we decide to do one scope or another is in some ways kind of moot, because we can clearly signal, like in practice, oh, this is a type X, this is an X type of emblem, this is a Y type of emblem, pretty quickly off the bat. And I think that kind of not taking that into account kind of overcomplicates the issue unnecessarily.
Thank you.
Rick?
Hi, Rick Wilhelm, PIR. I'd like to offer a perspective on not separating. Sorry, get closer to the mic.
No,
Tilt
turn
the
it
mic,
up.
Russ
Point,
does.
there you go.
There we go. Offer perspective in support of unifying digital and physical. It occurs to me while I was sitting here thinking about it that we probably also already have use cases like this. I'll offer that at present, press operatives are probably using drones in interesting areas, we'll just say. Spaces that might be controlled by military or peacekeeping forces or something like that. These obviously have a physical presence because you can look at them and see them on the ground. And they also have, would also have a digital presence in airspace when you worry about deconflicting airspace so that the drone doesn't get taken out of the sky aggressively. And so, you know, if we're sitting here thinking, and that seems to me, it probably is happening today or should be happening today and might not be happening gracefully. And this might be an opportunity for a technology solution to clean up that sort of a problem. If I can sit here after one cup of coffee and come up with that, there's probably a dozen more that are rattling around in people's heads, things like that. Bill might also have things like that in his head that are similar blurring of the line between digital and physical places like this. Also, this example of the press drone is another example, I think, why we need to be careful about embedding how the thing is treated in the digital emblem itself, because how a thing is treated is very context dependent on when the thing is encountered in the environment, physically, temporally, and situationally. And so that is going to depend. And so if we embed how it's treated in the emblem itself, that's going to be a losing proposition, I think. Thank you.
Thanks.
Michael?
Go ahead.
Am I next in the queue? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike Rosa, NSA. I was wanting to plus one some comments made by some earlier speakers. I'm not too sure in the sense of terminology for digital emblem how much we need to belabor the point of what type of assets. If just taking, for example, the Red Cross that people have been discussing, if the whole point is to signal that the Red Cross is a digital emblem, at the end of the day, it's a digital emblem, and then we're trying to set a framework that's secure and at the same time possibly extensible for how maybe people would use the emblem in their own use case. So I also think some people were leaning towards definition or bullet 2. I don't know how much we put things like codified into law as part of our definitions, but yeah, just wanted to highlight that and just, again, talking from a naive perspective on the use cases that this is trying to address. But I think there's if anything, the opportunity comes from after we get a definition in the charter rolling and what the scope is for the use cases. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jessica?
Hi. I wanted to point back to a point that Arnaud made and kind of tease it apart a bit, where he was talking about sort of what is the red line in the physical world that if you cross, you've gone too far, and there's some punitive action or repercussions for that. And in looking at the SPICE working group, there's a very similar definition to the attributes you had on the previous slide, where there's an issuer, a holder, and a verifier. I think with digital emblems, the goal, I guess the clear difference is the asset and the linking to that asset. So if you, in the second definition, I think setting aside like a specific protection under law, I think that there needs to be some aspect of how this asset needs to be treated, because it's different from just attesting or authorization that this asset is owned by who it says it is. It implies a certain treatment that is required. And maybe that's as specific as IHL. Maybe it could be expanded to something like, if you attack this asset, there could be disastrous repercussions in the physical world or in the digital world, but something to make sure that it's treated a certain way, or be able to verify that it's been acknowledged to have those properties.
So before you run away, clarifying question from my perspective, would that treatment be indicated via reference to whatever normative framework says this is how it's, these are the protections? Are you advocating that the digital emblem has to include attributes that say, and these are the actions that you can or can't take with this?
I guess that depends on the format of the digital emblem. If it's something that those attributes communicate, or just the existence of an emblem communicates, and the type of it, then I think that gets too far into kind of how you want to implement those complexities. But I guess just aside from something that is only attested, there needs to be some sort of proof that it was seen.
Because I know that some of the conversations that we've had around essentially that second definition, there's an assumption that if the law or the framework changes, you wouldn't necessarily have to change the digital emblem.
Yeah.
But the verifiers would have to understand what that law actually says. And so if the law changes, they would have to change their interpretation, but the digital emblem is still intact.
Yeah, I guess mostly I'm just trying to get back to the protective aspect of it. Maybe like exactly what actions they can and cannot take is too much detail to put into an emblem, but just my 2 cents.
All right.
Thank you.
Nalini?
Yeah, Nalini Elkins. Sorry, I'm new to this, and so just ignore me if this has already been discussed. But some of this seems to imply that you care. That is, that you're a nice person who's gonna obey these things. Because it seems to me like this might make it really easy, if you're not a very nice person, to just identify who to take out.
Yeah,
if
so
you know what I mean.
Nalini, that's a topic we covered at the last BOF.
Okay,
at
great,
some length.
sorry.
Yep.
This is Daniel Cohn-Gilmore with the ACLU. I think this question about what is a digital emblem is a distraction from what we need to do. I think what we need to do with the working groups is decide the last question here. Are we caring about this for protective and audit? And I think we need to decide whether we're talking about digital and physical. And I think we need to decide, my preference is that if we want this working group to actually complete something, that we should be talking about an indicator for a digital asset, whatever that means, with a clear scope, so we know what it applies to, and it is an indicator of protective information that can be assessed without the validator revealing themselves. Those are the aspects that we need to care about. And specifically, whether it has to do with a rule of law or a normative framework or whatever, we want it to be verifiable, but not everyone's going to have the same legal jurisdiction. So it's not going to be verifiable in law in some cases. And I think we need to be focusing on a specific use case. And I think the one to focus on is the protective, digitally scoped one. Because if we try to do the entire world of different kinds of signals we could produce and different kinds of things in the physical world that we could map to, this is going to go on forever.
Hi, Rowan May. I just wanted to remind people to, when you say your name, if you just please say your name at the mic when you speak. And if you give your affiliation and it's an acronym, please spell it out, even though I know that American Civil Liberties Union is ACLU, but not everybody does, or JHU or whatever. Anyway, I'm Rowan May. So I think that, I suspect that there are more people in this room that want to also cover physical assets and not just digital assets than there are not. But I think that would be a great place for us to have a poll, for example. Okay. And so while I understand the reasons why DKG wants us to focus on the most narrow thing possible, I think that it is also possible for us to do this slightly larger scope and being very careful about not boiling the ocean here with a limited set of bindings. And I think that will keep us from exploding our scope. So I'm going to ask if the chairs might be willing to do that kind of a poll at some point in the near future. Thank you.
We'll get to that.
So, yeah, let's do Samit, then we've locked the queue. So the rest of you, we're going to move on.
Great. Hey, everyone. So I'm Samit Dakuna from the ICRC. Thank you. International Committee, you're much taller than me. International Committee of the Red Cross. So I just want to come back on this question of why. So of course, for us, codified in the law is quite important for the use case of the Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystal. And the reason is that that is the key information that's being shared. So for those of you that were there last time in Vancouver, you might remember that one of the points that I made is that the protective emblems of the protective Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystal, not the indicative emblem, which I'll let some of my other colleagues talk about, but the protective emblem is like a bit like a stop sign, right? So it doesn't actually communicate, the information that's communicated is not necessarily an affiliation. So, if a party to a conflict sees an emblem, they don't necessarily know, who's using that emblem, like whether it's the military using it or civilian or the ICRC or what kind of hospital it is. The information that's communicated is a legal obligation. So this thing needs to be respected and protected. And so for us, that's why that aspect is quite key for our use case. And of course, the other use cases that are IHL emblems, because the information that's communicated is a legal protection.
And so, Sumit, before you actually leave the microphone, I'm curious as to, going back to Jessica's question, is the view from your perspective that you just need to be able to indicate that it's protected under international humanitarian law, or do you actually need to signal what the actions are or aren't allowed for the verifier to perform on that?
Yeah, good question. So I mean, ultimately, the distinctive emblem, so the physical emblem, is aimed at parties to conflict, right? So parties to conflict are the ones that have these specific obligations in international humanitarian law. So when there's an armed conflict and an emblem is displayed, they have certain specific obligations. So I talked about it a bit last time. I won't get too much into the details, but it goes beyond merely just not attacking this thing. They have to, and that's the key term we use, and it was restated last week when the international conference with all states of the world confirmed that this is an obligation that also applies to the use of ICTs, which is they must respect and protect that asset. But that's an obligation for parties to conflict. That information itself doesn't necessarily need to be communicated by the emblem. What needs to be communicated by the emblem is this asset is displaying an emblem. And then it's for the parties to conflict to know what their obligations then are vis-a-vis that asset.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so I think it's probably time to sit down, Brian, and join the thronging masses of people who are disagreeing with each other. I think this question of whether the thing is digital or physical is kind of at the core of some of the disagreements that we have here. So we're going to ask some questions, knowing full well that the answers to these questions will not necessarily help us in the short term, but we want to get a kind of sense of where people are on this one.
So just
And to sort of clarify that, I think Tommy made the point and several others sort of doubled down on this one. This is not about whether this is a physical thing or a digital thing. It's about the means of interaction with the thing, I think primarily. So think about that. Or the first.
There is a little trouble with Meet Echo right now, so please give a little bit longer than you might.
Sure. So we'll leave this open for a little while. The second question we were going to ask to sort of preload that one.
Did I just hear you right, where you said this is about the means of interaction with the thing?
Well,
not
it's always
about
going to
the
be a
thing itself?
digital interaction when it's a digital emblem that we're talking about. I think it's.
Is the asset a physical thing in scope or not? I think is where, or is the asset only digital?
But that sounds like exactly the opposite of what Martin just said.
Okay,
But
yeah,
I think
I'm
I'm
we're
fine
going to
with
need to
either
make this
one.
clear then, aren't we? Where is it in the
Looking
chat?
at the first definition that was on the slide, right? We were discussing whether linked to a digital asset, do we want to remove digital or not? When we're, and the room is split.
Yeah. Stephen points out that he understood what was going on until I tried putting
Yes.
words on it. And I think this is probably about as informative as I expected. We'll probably leave
But
this for a second more and then kill it. Yeah. So the second question was about this this aspect that appears in several of these, where the treatment of the asset that then is expected to follow on from receiving an emblem is somehow codified in law, and whether that is an essential part of the definition that we're talking about.
Essential or essential for our scope?
Essential for, I think essential for our scope, yes. I think in many contexts, it's absolutely essential. And particular use cases will have this be essential. But the question is whether or not the scope of the work that we undertake needs to constrain itself to one or other of these things.
Could I try to rephrase that?
Okay, please do.
Will the scope of this working group restrict itself to cases that have an emblem with some legal treatment or basis?
Codified in laws, yes. Not necessarily codified in law,
You might
isn't
want
it?
to use W's rather than Y's.
But the question, it's yes and no.
You said lay rather than law.
Ah, sorry. Law, that's what I meant. That was a typo. So, that's my typing, not.
Yeah. You did it twice though. It's very consistent. All right.
This one we're actually seeing.
It's just starting to. Hmm. 2 to 1 doesn't really tell us very much though.
But it's way different than the last one.
Yeah.
All right, seems to be stabilizing.
Yeah, all right. Do you want to open up the queue again? Well, or do you want to start on the charter?
Yeah, that's what we need to do.
All right. Do we actually get remote video in this room?
Yes.
Oh, you're getting it. No one else is.
Oh, that's interesting. So only if they have the tool open. All right. We're at this point, we're going to move on to the discussion of the charter text. Tommy, do you want to just display the?
I've got it in the chair slides if you want to do that.
Okay.
So what we might do, Tommy, if you want to give us a quick 5 minute of what it is that you heard and you understood, and where you think you're taking the charter, and sort of contextualize this a little bit, and then we'll sort of get into the blow-by-blows.
Certainly. Okay, so since the last BOF, we started writing a unified charter, and we started with an attempt to bucketize the different types of emblems that were being discussed, which was wildly unsuccessful. And so the current charter text we'll be reviewing today backs out a bit and talks about what kind of work would need to be done for the use cases that we're going to adopt, without actually expressing any opinions about what that scope is, which is something we're going to have to discuss right now. In that restructuring, we took a stab at defining what digital emblems were, which at least was a little less contentious, but clearly what we just discussed, and then proceeds to break down into 3 buckets of work that a new working group would need to address, namely, and I forget the exact nouns used, but the format of the emblem, how the emblem is validated, and then how the emblem is conveyed or discovered. And so that, at least as the mailing list discussion progressed, seemed to have some lukewarm, I'll avoid the word consensus, but it seemed to be a little more popular than previous attempts at a charter, mainly because we dodged the question of, well, what use cases should the new working group, or at least a new working group, limit itself to? Because that's not in there anymore, the existing charter text, I'm assuming we're going to review itself literally, seemed to be less contentious, and it'll be interesting to hear from anyone who doesn't agree with that, because that signal has gotten low. So if you are in that signal, please say so. Thank you. There we go. Reusable format, validation mechanisms, and discovery mechanisms. The discussion got a little quiet here at the end on the charter itself, which is also indicative to me that we've kind of reached a stable point, and we just need to tackle the question of what are the limits of a new working group to form, noting that there are multiple possibilities here. Various things have been brought up on the discussion here at the end, which is, well, we should include everything that has been discussed, and if we need to break out multiple solutions within the group or not is something the one working group can handle. Another split, or another approach that has been discussed, is the notorious physical versus digital split, where we need a new working group for the digital, and physical looks like some other working groups. And a third, I believe, has been protective specifically versus other things. I saw no consensus on the list for which would be preferable, and I expect that to be the bulk of today's discussion. Good summary?
Thanks, Tom. And so to the discussion that we just had, one of the things that we're trying to understand as sort of chairs of this is whether or not a narrower scope is absolutely essential to ensure the success of a working group, or whether a broader scope is the only thing that delivers any value to anyone involved, and we therefore have to deal with the broader scope. And potentially whether or not there's some ways in which work within a working group could be split between different options. There's a lot of options here. Keep that in mind. We're going to go through this in terms of understanding objections, but I think we will come back after the end of this discussion to the bigger questions of what that scope will be.
So all of this text has been on the mail list for a while, right? Are there any concerns people want to raise with the introduction to the draft charter? Rohan.
Hi, Rowan May. I think that unless we establish a scope of the use cases, we're not going to establish a scope of the requirements, and we're never going to finish. So I think the charter will need to come up with some scope.
So are you advocating we do a requirements doc, whether it's published or not? Or are you advocating further on the use cases. That's a distinction I'm trying to tease apart.
What I'm saying is, I think the charter is going to need to, is going to say, we're going to consider use cases in the following bucket. And then we'll take those use cases, and then we'll find the requirements in those use cases that are in scope.
Do you think the charter currently reflects that?
I like
well
the
enough?
charter otherwise. I think other than that thing that I think is the only thing which is missing, I think the charter is a good place, and we could, for people who want to do more things, we can reach out earlier, we can add things, we can work another working group that does related work.
No, I notice you have a computing device handy. Perhaps I can impose upon you to, under this high pressure circumstance, just write down a few ideas about that and share it with the group.
Well, I was going to kind of wait to the end, but if you want, I can make my radical proposal about the use case scope. No? Okay.
Peter.
Peter Dienig. I have a clarifying question. From what I hear in the examples, we're talking about Red Cross and similar emblems. Now, that definition would also cover things like a cybersecurity mark, which is codified in law, at least it's going to be in Europe, maybe other places, attached to a digital product. You can argue back and forth whether that's international law or not. It probably isn't, but the clause about the international law is just descriptive. It's not normative in the charter. So I wonder whether the group thinks that the boundary of the scope is strong enough here.
Okay. Ori?
Hi, Ori Steele. I just want to confirm the sort of the process flow you're trying to achieve here with the text. We're going to go sort of slide by slide on the current charter text. You're looking for suggested changes or improvements to the text on the slide.
And an understanding of where we are consensus-wise.
Okay, cool.
Both.
Thank you.
Sorry. Roman?
Oh, there is. I cannot see.
He speaks well out, but you'll hear it.
Hi, Roman Dinlilu as an individual. I was wondering with that last blob of text with the pointer to the use case, in what way that was scoping the body of work in the charter? Does that suggest everything written in that unversioned document needs to be serviced by the working group? Is it intended to be informative? So I think the text would benefit from some clarity as to whether the success of the working group is predicated on servicing whatever is in that draft, with no kind of merit on what's in the draft.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think as we work through this one, that would have to be inlined into a charter to be realistic, unless the document was very crisp and clear itself.
Yeah, Arnaud Tadei, Broadcom. So frankly speaking, when I read the introduction, it's very hard for me to understand what we're introducing here. I mean, when I read the text as it is, the first sentence, I understand it to some level. I have a problem with the legal aspect of it, but let's park it for a moment. Then the two next sentences, I don't understand the logic of these sentences here. The last sentence, today there exists no accepted, I understand this one, but I think there is something that doesn't work, at least for my Franglish, doesn't work in the flow of how I read right now. So a bit like Roman, I think we should rework this introduction from my point of view.
David?
I wasn't really sure, sorry, David, wasn't really sure how to phrase this question, but like, when you're asking about do we need legal involvement or not, I felt like we're not quite there yet. Like, legal stuff will follow if this is successful, I feel like. If this work can define an emblem and make it work, then laws will be codified around that. So what's more important is anybody actually going to use it? And the charter mentions there are stakeholders that have provided requirements and they're documented, but I sense that everyone's still kind of vague on what those requirements are, who those stakeholders are. If we can identify a use case, some others have mentioned, like I'd like to see a use case and just focus on that. And then that would be more important than whether or not there are laws. We can assume the laws will come later, but we can make that a little bit more clear. I'm feeling like that would help a lot.
Oh, no. Thanks, David. Where's, oh, no. No, he's in the queue.
Ted Hardy, I actually think I read that sentence completely differently than Arnaud did, so maybe it needs clarification. Because what I read was, what we're going to define here is a collection of standards for issuing, applying, and validating attestations, let us say, where those attestations are relevant for emblems which are recognized under international law, and not that where the standards are recognized under international law. So possibly we need to clarify that, because I think this is actually what narrows the scope of the group entirely. If the presumption is that the driving use case is that set of emblems which are already recognized under international law, and I think particularly international humanitarian law, any later rescoping to increase the scope to other kinds of attestations which need to be made seems like a reasonable later thing to expand to if you start with that driving use case. Where if you start with the idea that it's any collection of things that you issue, apply, and validate, provided that later somebody comes along and applies a legal standard to it, I think you end up in kind of a worse situation, and very much what Peter was pointing out, right? A mark required by the EU to indicate your compliance with a particular, let's say, IoT certification for security is not what I think you were driving at when the mailing list discussion was going on. So I think maybe we want to make that final sentence of the introduction a lot crisper. And I totally agree that the use cases being specified needs to come in line if people are going to realistically read the charter and concur.
Arnaud?
Hi again. So I agree with the previous speaker about the under international law point. One thing about the cybersecurity mark, I mean, if people believe that the CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act, is going to give anything, I wish them good luck. This one is going to be a catastrophe. Right? DORA will be good, but the CRA is going to be a very difficult one. If we have less than 100 delegated acts on this one, we will be lucky. So the other thing I wanted to say was back to a previous conversation, I think it's Daniel and Sarah who made the point. What are we trying to achieve? I think we're trying to achieve both protection and audit. We want to say, careful, don't attack this asset. And second, if you do so, we will audit the situation and you will go to jail. That's basically what we want to say. So why isn't it there? We could be much simpler on the introduction and go straight to what we are trying to do. That's what we are trying to do.
Okay. Jim?
Jim Reid, RTFM LLP. Hope I don't have to spell out what the acronym means. I agree with the previous two comments that have been made for the mic here. I think this whole business needs to be kept as simple and straightforward, certainly in its first instance. So let's focus on dealing with the issue that the colleagues from the Red Cross have identified and come up with a solution that deals with that specific issue first. We may want to look into it further into the wider aspects of considerations of other aspects of digital emblems and assets and attributes and all the rest of it. That, in my view, can come later. If we try to tackle this now from the outset, we'll be talking about this, or the grandchildren will be talking about this many, many years from now. We're never going to get anything useful or productive done if we try to tackle it all right now. So let's solve the immediate problem just now, but be aware, of course, that there may be further things that come along later. And if and when those things come along, we can then look at maybe having either a new working group or rechartering the existing one. But let's please try and deal with the initial problem that we're trying to fix here. Thank you.
Thank you.
next slide.
Okay, so the charter text next explains what the problem is. It's on the slide, it's been on the mail list. Any support or concerns with this? Okay, it seems this part people are pretty much okay with.
Nick.
Uh, Again, I'm so grateful to the authors for trying to do this. Trying to cover the very generic set, of course, makes this much more abstract and less useful for scoping our work. So I wouldn't object to this, but if we go this abstract, it will make our work harder. It will just put off the question of actually doing the work of narrowing it to the first thing of the working group. If that's the only way to do it, fine, but we should know that's the situation.
Hi, Roman Canelio again as an individual. A little bit of the same comment as I had on the prior section. Looking at that last sentence, I'm left wondering why we're saying something about specifically what a use case is kind of doing. What does that tell us about the problem statement? I don't understand.
Michael?
Hey, Michael Rosa, NSA. I guess it's just a bit of a minor comment at the moment while I'm still trying to digest this, but we kind of talk about conditions and criteria. And I'm just trying to, I guess, clarify that we're basically asserting requirements with those words within this problem statement versus, unless we're trying to talk about existential conditions that may influence how the models are informed. But to me, that's just still requirements. I don't know. So just wanted to highlight that as just maybe like tightening the words used. Thanks.
I don't know.
Oh, no, it was turned funny in the interface. Oh, no, back again. Welcome back.
Sorry, not sure. Yes, it's me. My line just broke. Yes, like Roman, I don't think this is capturing the problem statement. For example, where is audit? We need to have a solution that is helping auditors to audit what happens. I think this should be there. I don't think it's clear enough for me.
Tommy Jensen, Microsoft, speaking as a co-author proponent. This text was designed essentially to address the point that each of these three areas described later, those three areas of work, will differ depending on the type of emblem being used. And so this text is saying, because we haven't decided on the scope yet, if we were to create a working group that encompassed all of them, before creating solutions, we would need to define what are the requirements specific to each of those buckets that would constrain a solution. If we can define a subset of scope that we're going to do in advance, a lot of this isn't going to apply anymore because we can be more specific and say validation methods will reuse in this way, discovery is interesting because of these requirements, et cetera. Just clarifying.
All right, let's go to the next one.
Goals.
This is not the goals section. This is the preface to the goals section. Reuse existing tools. Liaise. Probably
don't make stuff up.
Probably move on to the next one, which is the
point,
the real point.
People happy with these goals? Eric.
Eric Vink, individual contributor in this case. I would love to see that point number one seems to be limiting right now to legally defined emblems, entities, and maybe leaving out a couple of them. I'm fine if the working group wants to be very restrictive, only talking about legally defined emblems, but why not expanding it?
Jonathan?
Okay, so I was wondering if there's any requirement on auditability. So, you know, is it part of our initial set of requirements that if you send this emblem and you actually weren't authorized to do so, or you were sending it inappropriately, that could then be demonstrated at a later date? Is that not, like, I feel like that's a requirement, because otherwise we're not going to have, like, everyone will just stick this emblem on everything.
Ted?
Ted Hardy, sorry, I thought Jonathan was going to talk longer than that. I think discovery mechanisms may be doing a bit of heavy lifting here, and we might want to be a little bit more explicit that we actually are talking about two things. One of which, how do we bind the attestation to a specific set of protocols? And then once you have that, how do you discover the digital emblems that are relevant for particular interaction? And so I think we might actually have the binding and the discovery as two different things rather than one single bullet point. Thank you.
Roman.
Roman Danilio as an individual. In reading the number one, the working group will be one gain kind of consensus. I just want to make sure I understand the words correctly. Are we using consensus in the sense of an IETF process or in something else? And then how do we know we have consensus from all of them? So I heard lots of different potential stakeholders. We haven't pinned it down. So we're going to go down a list of, you are my stakeholder, you have agreed, and we're going to codify that somehow. So talk me through that. I don't understand that.
Okay. Where's Hank?
Yeah, hi, this is Hank. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Wonderful. So, okay, there's this second point of validation mechanisms for digital emblems. I heard the term attestation a lot today, and what I assume you mean is just a self-assertion, unless you want this to be actually really trustworthy and believable. And I think that's the dance the rats do. So, I think it should be very clear what level of assurance you want to achieve here with this validation. So if it's just a signed structure and you have a trust anchor, I think that's a well-known building block that is signature checking and not so hard. If you want to have believable assertions, especially if you try to add even metadata to a digital emblem, I think that is remote attestation. But I might be wrong, and but I just wanted to put this to the record.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Use cases, framework.
Deliverables, yeah. No. Use cases, a framework, data model validation, and discovery. So basically 2 informational documents and 2 standard track documents.
Now, we've already heard from some people that they think that publishing use cases and requirements may be unwise until we have more concrete solutions in place, but any other feedback on this?
Kathleen?
Kathleen Moriarty, just to put a counterpoint to Hank's
I don't think that there's a difference in terms of where your keys are coming from in terms of one being more trustworthy than another. So I think format is what would decide if it's RATs, if you're bundling it in an EAT, versus if you're using a PKI issued key and certificates. Both can be considered just as trustworthy depending on how it's done and how they're protected and how they're issued.
Sure. Roman?
Good morning, Roman Dene is an individual. On the line that says data model and validation and standards track, are we confident we only need one document covering all of the use cases that do validation and we wouldn't want more because there's multiple discovery? I feel like those are pairs.
Yep, good question.
Good point.
Eric?
Okay, so I'm more about the point you made, I think, Russ, whether we need to do working on the use case first and the solution later or not. I am, this time with a slight AD, I would love to that we refine the use case and the requirement first and then work on the solution. Not being completely naive, right? So we are engineer, we know that, okay, this use case is completely out of scope. But I think putting a sequence there may be useful. I would hate that we privilege discovery for something which is no use case.
Okay, thank you. Andrew?
Hi, Andrew Camping. I think agreeing with what was just said, building a solution without a use case seems a bold approach, which would likely lead to a lot of wasted effort, probably. So I'd reverse that order.
Thank you. Felix?
Hi, Felix Linke, ETH Zurich. So I think it's very important that in the charter, we constrain ourselves to concrete use cases, as has been said multiple times before, because otherwise the problem becomes unsolvable. And I would like to stress that like why the ICIC came to the IETF in the first place. The ICIC, in my understanding, came to the IETF because they will work on this problem and it will affect, as Samit said on the mailing list, the resolution was adopted by consensus. I hope I said that correctly, and Samit nods. That was backed by all 191 national societies of the red CR star of this world and all 194 states of this world. And this solution will be used by potentially all militaries of this world, by all these societies, and even more. I think it covers a huge set of things. It's a big problem to solve. And if we mingle now all these things together, I think it will take ages. We will not get anything done. And moreover, it's sad that we're running out of time. You know, Ori, for example, asked on list, I think we had great productive discussions on the specific problems that apply to the digital emblem in the use case of the red CR star. And I think it was quite obvious that all these discussions don't apply at all to all the other emblems being discussed. Ori asked, are there any stakeholders in the room who could validate whether implementations work? They weren't always. Today we have the Irish Red Cross here. We brought someone from UNESCO. I think someone from the British Red Cross introduced themselves on the mailing list. They're all here because they care about this. And I think none of the discussions we had today helps them in any way, right? And I find this really sad. And if we now defer this use case discussion, like we had the same discussion last BOF, right? I think the consensus was there was no consensus that this is the same problem. And now we're here with like 2 minutes left. And, or is it, oh, no, 30, okay. Well, then I'm a bit more happy, but I'm a bit more happy. Yeah, but I think it's like this problem that we're trying to tackle is not simple. And we could generalize it into oblivion, right? We can say we work on signed statements, right? Would work as well, maybe. Okay, Richard Barnes might disagree, but I think this is a big problem. We have a lot of people in the room that care about this problem, and it would be good to work on it in isolation to get it solved. Thank you.
Arnaud?
Arnaud.
Tommy could have gone, but so the deliverables again, I'm missing. I have the impression we are doing one part of the job, but we are missing the big action. So I don't see again the red line crossing where it happens, and I don't see where we protect, where we audit. So, for example, I don't see how we define how good looks like, right? How good looks like is that we've done all of this, and now an attacker that was a naive attacker wants to attack, and so he said, whoa, 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 I'm going to make a mistake, I back up, and I'm not doing this attack. When bad looks like is when a nation state has a purpose to attack and crosses that line. He's seen the emblems, we can see that, and he's crossing it. And I do not see any coverage for that whole part. So I would expect, I don't think this is bad, I'm just saying I'm missing some pieces in the bullets down there. Okay, I don't know, I could propose things later, but at the moment, I have the impression we are not really resolving the problem, so to speak.
Tommy Jensen, Microsoft. As a proponent, this was written as a diplomatic way of saying we need a working group that we can dedicate to doing this, and if it means that we need to use scoping as our first milestone, that's fine. Now switching as a individual contributor, I've been swayed by some of the chat discussion that's something, the use case specifically of the first bullet ought to be pulled into this charter and leave requirements as the first working group item, and say that there are multiple spaces of interesting use cases here that ought to be left to rechartering one at a time as we expand a minimum viable scope. I don't want to arbitrarily pick use cases. The line that I would delineate on is which ones bring different technical requirements. And to me, I think I agree with Ecker from the mailing list that the most interesting one is how we do assets not knowing when validators are checking for their emblem. If we want to use digital, because that's specific to digital cases, I haven't heard any of the physical use cases bring that up, whether we want to make that protective, whether we just want to go digital specific, fine, but we should do that now. But that's why that was there.
DKG.
Hi, this is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore with the American Civil Liberties Union. Thanks, Rohan, for correcting my acronyms. What I don't see here is where the emblem's scope is described. And I think this is a real problem. And I've said this before, and I'm just going to give the analogy again. If you see a red cross on someone's sleeve, you know the red cross applies to the person, not the arm. And I am not convinced that we know how the digital emblems are going to be applied and what the scope of them is. If you see a red cross emblem associated with a TLS session, what does that mean? Is it the TLS session? Is it everything associated with the domain name that was part of the TLS session? Is it the data that is in transit during that TLS session? Is it the entire computer? Is it the database that interaction touches? I don't think we know. And I think we should try to write it down, and I don't know which of these 4 bullets it fits in. And that's just the digital thing. If we're talking about looping in physical stuff, I think we have another set of questions. So I'd like to make this small initially, where we can understand what the emblem actually applies to, and I don't know where you put it in here. Is it in the data model and validation? Is it in the discovery? They seem like they're connected to me.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. So first, I'll add to what Felix said. So indeed, there was this international conference last week, and every state of the world and every national society unanimously agreed that the ICRC needs to continue this work on developing a digital Red Cross, Crescent, and Crystal. I'll probably just also add that the other part of what they've confirmed this mandate on is incorporating this into international law, so exploring the different sort of legal and political avenues to ensure this becomes part of the law. And I think that that's somehow tied to a lot of these different discussions, because when we talk about international law, some treaties are between 2 states, some treaties are between a group of states, some treaties, most states don't want to touch at all and they don't want to update, and there are processes that indeed will take until we all have grandkids to become the law. But that's not the case with this, right? So every Every state of the world agrees that this needs to happen and it needs to happen quickly. And they made that clear last week. And the reason is that when the physical distinctive emblem was created, it was created to identify a specific protection in the law that exists. The protection already exists. And if there wasn't a way to identify it, then that protection was meaningless. And now we find ourselves in a situation where that protection exists in a space, right? So to digital assets, and there's no way to identify those digital assets. And that's a concern, not just for our movement, not just for the national sites, for the ICRC and the Federation, but it's a concern for every state because they have medical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and they have no way of identifying that to their adversaries, that this is protected and you cannot touch this. So they're all interested in this, and this is why the ICRC is investing so much resources into this. And aside from all of the technical work that we're doing, we're investing a lot in speaking with states, we're working with our movement to try and make this the law, and both of those need to sort of work in tandem. And actually tying, Daniel, to what you said, yeah, I mean, that's another question also that's asked of us with respect to the incorporation into the law, because they also want to know, okay, so what assets are we talking about? And for us, that discussion would be super interesting to have here, because then we have something tangible to take back with the diplomats and to say, look, these are the discussions that take place at the IETF. This is what they've identified as digital assets that should be protected, and we can try to make that the law. But this is an ongoing process where, as a movement, I think we're really dedicating a lot of resources.
Hi, Rowan May. So quick response to Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, DKG. I think that the answer to the question of like, what does this, TLS marking on a TLS section apply to? That's one of the things that needs to be in the requirements documents. So I think I think we know where to put that work, and we can certainly start doing that work there. On a totally different topic, from where I'm looking at this problem, I've been thinking very carefully about the press use case, the ICRC use case, and a couple of other use cases which are a little less well-defined. But I'm going to make the radical suggestion that maybe the press use case is a strict superset of the press and ICRC use cases. That it requires validator privacy, that it requires the ability to turn off and on advertising of its emblem, which in, for example, the ICRC case, you would not turn off, you would leave on. That it applies to a limited set of bindings to physical objects, but it also has requirements for digital assets. If people are looking for some concrete use case that gives us a set of requirements that cover people who have shown up and displayed interest and energy in working on this problem, I think that's not a bad place to start.
Michael.
Hi, Mike Rose at NSA. Something DKG actually said that resonated with me just now. This might make it even more confusing, and I'm sorry. As we've been talking about digital assets versus physical assets, talking about TLS session, now we're talking about data in transit. So it's not always, so the digital asset is data in transit. A digital asset could be the, something hosted on someone's server. It could also be the physical asset that is the computer or the server itself. Am I understanding that in terms of us trying to discuss what the scope could end up being, that we are now expanding scope to that as well, or maybe that's just a misinterpretation by my part?
It's a good question. All right, Mike?
Michael Christie.
Just to respond to what you were saying, which actually, I mean, it doesn't sound insane. It's totally possible. But there are, I think you need to take into account the distinctions. And one of them might be that we don't, the international media doesn't have a central authority that would credential media, whereas the Red Cross and ICRC would be different in that regard. So, yeah. possibly. And other considerations would also be different. For instance, the ICRC, I think the position is pretty firm that this applies only to digital assets such as servers, whereas in the press case, there isn't actually anything protecting our photos or the information that we transmit over the internet. But we would be wanting to try to use this, if we use this, for press signs, which are a physical asset in a sense, which we would. So there are distinctions there. I mean, I can't see why you can't take one use case and then extrapolate other use cases from it, so long as you make sure you're including all of the voices, all of the stakeholders that you need in that conversation to ensure that the requirements are flexible enough.
Brent Zundell. It feels like in traditional IETF fashion, we're overcomplicating things. Like what we've been asked to do is provide a way to digitally display a marker. And whether the marker applies to an arm or a body, or whether it's about a physical asset or a digital asset, it feels like those things they're interesting to talk about, and they're cool questions, and I think they will definitely come up in the work of this group. But the first thing that's been asked as a delivery item is a way to digitally display this protective emblem. And anything beyond that feels like it's interesting, but it's not necessarily necessary.
Ori?
Hi, Ori Steele. I just want to echo what Roman was saying about the data model and the discovery pieces being kind of maybe linked together, and some of the other comments from folks that I've heard here, sort of reflecting on everything we've heard at the mic. There's specific types of digital emblems, kinds of digital emblems. Inside of a specific kind, there's some attributes that are really important to that kind of emblem. The validation is going to be specific to that kind of emblem. So what does it mean to validate one kind of emblem versus another? The discovery of that specific kind of emblem may also need to be unique. And coming back to this, do you need different kinds of emblems to talk about a TLS session or the data that's moving in it? Those are really interesting, conversations, and the IETF is definitely a place that can help tease apart the technical details there, distinguishing those components of protocols. So I think the last part about understanding, when you encounter a digital emblem in an IETF protocol, what does it apply to? It's the same theme, that there's this type or kind of emblem specific stuff, and that you kind of have to weave that all the way through each of these to get something that's easy for folks to understand. I think we can do that for IETF protocols because we know those protocols really well, but some of these other topics that are outside of that, I think, are going to be difficult for the IETF to do well at. Thanks.
David?
David, just to respond to the comment that it's not necessarily necessary to know whether it's the arm or the body, or if it's digital or not. I think I feel like people are struggling to understand, like, what is necessary for what? Like, what is this necessary for? Like, who's struggling to figure out that redcross.com is a humanitarian organization, or who's struggling that bbc.com is a press organization? I think the governments are well aware of who's who on the internet and what the implications are of attacking these digital assets, and that's not a problem that needs to be solved. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? And I liked someone mentioned, like, oh, I think auditing is an interesting problem to solve. It's not just that we want to prevent attacks, but we want to be able to confirm that they have happened. Then it's very important to understand what is the scope of attack, what counts as an attack, what's not, and how do we audit that has happened. Just a suggestion, but I think the key point here is, like, what is the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? What problem are we solving?
So I'm hearing a common theme that is, let's start with the international humanitarian laws related digital emblems And then once we've solved that, expand to other use cases. Does anyone think that is absolutely the wrong thing to do? Okay, I'm not surprised, Bill. But that is what I hear in the room. Okay, so the next slide is some normal BOF questions.
Yeah, so I think there's before we get into these, I think there's one question that I have not heard a clear answer to in all of this, which is whether that narrower scope is something that people absolutely need to have in the charter, or whether it is the first thing that a working group tackles. As in,
related.
Yeah, it is entirely related. Okay. But you might imagine having a charter that's somewhat generic, like the one that's been presented, and then the working group takes on as its first work items the exercise of finding the narrow scope and starting to tackle that exclusively. That may be a management question for a working group. That would be a reasonable way to approach this problem. There is also the potential approach whereby you start with a very narrow charter in the first place and agree on that narrow scope, at which point the working group is constrained to work within that scope.
That's correct.
And that is a question that I don't think we've entirely resolved here, and I'd like some input on that one.
I think Roman and Eric want to talk to that.
Good morning, Roman Dinity as an individual. I came up to say exactly what you just said. Kind of, Martin, what you said, Russ, about the idea we're leaning kind of one particular way, but what does the charter text say? I'd love to kind of hear what the group would like, because I think it's a big difference how we polish and do next steps.
Eric?
Yeah, and basically my point is the same. So we really need to define now what we need to put in the charter.
Yes.
And personally, I would love, an individual guy, get a broad charter. But if I'm in the RAF, I'm happy to be in the RAF.
Right.
Brent Zundell, while I think it would be a mistake to not focus on that core use case initially, I also think it would be a mistake to not keep the charter broad, because in exploring that core use case, you may run into something that the charter restricts, and you really don't want to end up there.
So you're advocating the broader words, but just put things in there that say, start with this one.
Yes.
Okay. Dennis?
Yeah, I think we've had a really powerful discussion on the complexity and nuance of this, especially in the meeting chat. And I think that's the strongest possible argument for a narrow charter with a clear scope, a clear set of deliverables that can really focus on that core problem. I think it can be broadened later and maybe parts of it can be reused. But from the get-go, we should focus on a very tight, meaningful scope because, as many people have pointed out, there's real complexity here and nuance, even within a very particular use case.
DKG?
I think we might.
Sure.
Rowan has asked which use case I mean. I'm thinking of international humanitarian law and specifically within the Red Cross use case, because to me, that is a use case with a very diverse set of stakeholders, with every national military, every national medical society. It has a huge array of different presentations that are needed for different variants of servers and other digital assets. And I think it's a really complex, really meaningful problem that has maybe the unique benefit of a clearly defined set of legal stakeholders, which can provide input to the requirements and the use case.
I know.
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I'd like to agree with Dennis's observation that the very narrow charter is still remarkably complex, and we should be focusing on a very narrow charter that addresses the international humanitarian use cases, whether that's bound by law or by norms. I don't really care, but I think that that is a very different use case than the use cases for things like customs handling. And I wanted to remind the group that one of the risks that we have not talked about today is that there are additional ways that these indicators could be abused if we make them generic. So if this is an arbitrary mechanism for creating arbitrary assertions about arbitrary parties that the parties may themselves decide they don't even want to emit, but somehow they're marked or they're obliged to emit in order to participate in the network, it becomes a whole separate potential targeting regime. And I think we should try to steer clear of making something that is arbitrarily extensible with arbitrary indicators that we can apply in arbitrary ways so that we don't have to have that part of the discussion here yet. If we want to expand the scope later after we've demonstrated that we've been able to solve the problem of a protective use case, I'm game to do that. But I think we have our work cut out for us for the protective use case.
Stephen Farrell from Trinity College Dublin, which is known as TC. I disagree with the last two speakers. Under the point DKG raised, there is no way you can have a container for images and related metadata without, I think, those arbitrary problems that you arbitrarily said arbitrary a number of times. I can't see that there's any way to solve any of these problems without something that potential. But that's for the working group to figure out. I would suspect that it's much more sensible to try and not have all this chartering discussion again, or have it bubbling up underneath the working group the whole time, and have a more generic charter that may in the charter call out that the IC case is the one to work on first, or as a milestone to make Eric happy. But I think a generic charter, not generic, but a more broad charter is a much better idea, because it's just in the nature of the kind of emblems we're talking about that they're not, huge chunks of this are not specific to ICRC.
Arnaud?
Yes, so I agree with Dennis and Daniel. I think the scope should be limited to exactly Red Cross scope. But at the same time, I want to make sure that if we design something there, that we design it completely, that we don't miss like protection and audit capabilities. Otherwise, we miss the target. And if we have to patch that later, then we are toast. So I would go for a narrow scope and a broad charter, like Eric.
Good. Arnaud?
Oh no, it's Rowan.
It's Rowan?
Yeah, he just said.
Hey, I just wanted to ask. I just wanted to say, like, one of the things maybe that Daniel Kahn-Gilmore was talking about in terms of reduction of scope was physical versus digital. The binding to a physical object, I think we could mitigate the scope problem if that binding were something that were put as a milestone toward the end, and it was a milestone that would only be addressed after the digital use cases were substantially far along.
Bill?
Bill Woodcock. I would just like to pose the thought experiment. If half the people were getting up to the mic and saying, no, the rest of you shouldn't be allowed to work on this. This is only for Blackwater to use in, a protocol for deciding who to kill, right? I think we'd be pushing back a little bit more. And the purpose of the IETF is work on interoperable standards that are open, that everybody can use, not to say, only one party gets to use it for one purpose, because that's not communication. We're here to standardize communication, not to do legwork for individual organizations to their specifications.
Okay, so Martin has been working on the text for this next question that we're going to do. Yeah. We only have a couple of minutes left, so we've locked the queue. Let's see how this question, and hopefully it's clarifying.
Yeah, I will attempt to get this right this time, but I'm not sure that I will, because this inevitably fails. But it seems like the question that's most pressing here is whether the charters start out with a very narrow scope that constrains what the working group can do. Obviously, that scope can be expanded through rechartering once that work is done, or whether the working group starts with a broader charter with some specific guidance that directs it towards specific use cases in the short term, but allowing for the possibility that the working group can take on a broader scope should the discussion lead to that. Right. That is what I'm going to ask. This interface is terrible, so forgive me if it looks a little mangled, but that's on the screen.
So yes, narrow. No means broad charter with do the humanitarian law first.
Yeah, don't fixate on that one. Don't fixate on that.
So what is it? Yes
We need to work out what that.
Yes, means.
We need to work out what that narrow means. But I think I've heard from a number of people that that focusing in on one specific use case would be preferable, and some others are saying no.
Don't
Richard.
focus, right?
Is effectively the difference between these whether a recharter is necessary before working on the second use case?
That's
Correct.
essentially right.
That's exactly right.
And to be clear, yes, the yes option here would be yes, a recharter would be needed before working on the second use case.
Correct.
Now that sounds like it's tactical, but we're seeing a lot of disagreement here right now. So it is not just tactical, apparently.
We're also getting.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. I think that's probably enough for now. Yeah.
They're roughly even.
So the working group is roughly split on that particular question. We will now ask the BOF questions, I think, and expect to find similar confusion, but we'll see how we go.
Okay.
It would not be a poll if someone wasn't getting up to the mic.
I mean, isn't this question kind of empty? What is the problem now?
Yeah. So I guess the question ultimately is, do we all think that everyone understands the problem?
Is the problem
exactly?
Yeah. So I mean, and then.
And I think if you're unclear about whether other people agree with your understanding of what problems we're here to solve, then say no.
Wow, two to one.
Sorry, by here, do you mean the problem statement? Do you mean the use cases? Sorry, maybe
Yes,
I'm a little
all
lost.
of these things, yeah. The set of these things that form what it is that the problems that the working group will work on. Do we all understand what problems a potential working group would be
Remember,
dealing
we
with?
had this discussion of the problem statement. We learned that there were some improvements needed here, but given those improvements from that discussion, do we have a feel for what we're going to work on?
Yeah, I think this is pretty clear.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Not going to spend too much time on this one. Now, here comes the fun question.
Well, in this, we meant scope as the scope of the work, not arm versus body.
Yes.
Correct.
Oh boy. Oh yeah, I'd be surprised if this one goes any. Oh, I'm surprised if people are saying yes.
No. Guess what? The no's are way. Okay.
All right, that's pretty clear. I'm not gonna make this any worse. All right.
So it's just, is the IETF the place to do this work, whatever it is?
Look, I don't even think we need to ask that question at this point. Clearly, there's a lot of work that we need to do to work on coming up with a clearly defined scope for a working group that
don't trip on your back.
is a single thing. Warren.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think it might actually still be worth asking the last question, with it not being quite the right place to do the work, but is this still a conversation we should carry on having? Do you think we might ever converge on something, or are we just never going to have
So you're asking the should we just stop now?
Should we just stop now, or should we try and have a third BOF which is doable, but only under weird circumstances, or is this clearly something we're never going to get consensus on?
Oh, I can't hit enter either. Oh.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, after that discussion, I would not I would not fault anyone for coming to the conclusion that no was the answer.
So now a word from our area director.
Okay, Eric, still the responsibility for this buff. I made a mistake by accepting it, but a different story. It looks to me the situation is completely unclear, right? I would be very uncomfortable to go in front of the ISG and chattering this working group right now.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm afraid we need to continue the work. And like Warren said, the rule is 2 buff, but we can make a 3rd one, right? So it's not fixed in stone. Or we start with something very narrow and might need to get the consensus on the mailing list. But honestly, I will not start a rechartering of the working group right now. I'm looking for other people here, but
yeah. I think the next step is to try and refine the charter on the mail list in the next couple weeks, right? Maybe by January, we can come to something and then see if we can convince Eric to take it to the ISG, because we are out of time.
And the last point, the question missing here is that are there people willing to work on this?
I think we've already seen that.
There are people having opinions
Yeah.
on it. Whether they want to work is a different story.
So, yes, good point. I would suggest that we're not going to reach any consensus if we continue to take this general shape of the problem. So we need to start talking about what the changes to the shape of the charter need to be in order to be successful. That was very clear here. And I would suggest 2 charters is now back on the table again.
Yep.
Many things are on the table at this point. Agreed. I mean, the ISG refused, just to be clear, having 2 charter, 2 working groups. But we are in front of the wall, right? So we need to move it.
Felix, go ahead if you can do it in a few seconds.
Yeah, I found it interesting that we had this discussion on, we do this first and then the other things later. My opinion is that these other things, not the Red CR use case, are perfectly in scope for other working groups like SPICE. And I think they should work on it. So just saying we work on this problem now doesn't exclude that the work on the other use case happens somewhere else. Maybe in a new working group, I have no opinions on that. But I think other working groups could take it as well. It's a bit sad that we only discussed, or that I only say it now.
Okay, thank you for your attention, and see you on the mail list.
And your patience.